is a pleasure to be with such wonderful curators. And we would like to ask you a few questions as we think about our work going into the future, and what we can do differently and what you all are doing differently, because you all are. And so maybe if we could just introduce ourselves.
Hi everyone. Ooh. Okay, let me know if that's better. Hi everyone. Yat Sháńdíín Brown Yanisha. Kia ani nishle bilagana bishchin to the flena dische do bilagana dishanele. So hi everyone. My name is Sháńdíín Brown. I'm Diné from Arizona, and I'm the Henry Luce Curatorial Fellow for Native American Art at the Rhode Island School of Design, or RISD Museum.
Hello, I'm Davison Packard Koenig. I'm the Executive Director of the Cal Sharp Historic Site in Taos, New Mexico. And full disclosure, my wife is Susan Falwell.
Good afternoon. I am J.R. Henneman, Director and Curator of the Petrie Institute of Western American Art at the Denver Art Museum, which is located on the homelands of the Arapaho, Ute, and Cheyenne people.
Y'all know me, Jill.
Hi everyone, my name is Jamie Powell. I am the Associate Director of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of Indigenous Art at the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, where I'm also a Senior Lecturer in Native American and Indigenous Studies. I am a citizen of the Osage Nation and having a proud moment because my former intern is on this panel with me. It's the first time we're on the same panel.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Rami Mize. I'm the Assistant Curator of American Art at the Portland Museum of Art, just about an hour south of here in Wabanaki homelands in the Dawnland, and I'm thrilled to be here with you all today.
Hello, my name is Ralph McGuire. I'm just kidding, you all know me, I'm Juan. Good to see you all again.
Should I start
You start.
it off? Okay. So we have a couple questions, but if you want to veer it to a different answer or a different kind of question that you want to, please feel free. As I said, this is a panel to understand what's happening now in curation and what can be our possibilities for the future. So the first question is, what are ways to integrate native and non-native art that you've found successful in your own work? And what do you want to do to change or make it better? I'll start with Jamie.
A couple years ago, I co-curated a show with some colleagues called This Land, American Engagement with the Natural World, and it was the first time that at the Hood Museum we had put our Native North American collections in conversation with a broader collection of American art, including diverse understandings of what American art can be. And for us, it raised a lot of questions around who gets to decide what's included in this canon of American art, and how, as we're trying to tell different and more inclusive and equitable and honest stories of our history as a nation, but of the art in our institutions, what are the strategies that we can use? And so that was a collaborative project. I'm actually trained, like Jill and many of our colleagues, in Native art as a cultural anthropologist. And so I didn't come to working in an art museum with all of the baggage that our colleagues who are trained as art historians carry. I often will be like, no, I don't know what you're talking about, when people start talking about the Gilded Age and things. They're like, oh, so-and-so. I'm like, no, I don't. Please tell me. But, the reverse of that is that I don't, automatically assume that I have to use a, kind of temporal or medium-specific arrangement of the works that I place in galleries. And I think the show here is a really great example of how, when you place different mediums in conversation with one another, or things that were created around the same time period, it shows a fuller and kind of more realistic and holistic conversation about kind of what was happening at the time. And so that's been, kind of one strategy that I've found to be useful.
Amy?
Oh, sure. I just want to say, yeah, I work at the Portland Museum of Art, and we also did a similar reinstallation project, a reimagining of how we were conceiving of and presenting and interrogating histories of American art, very broadly conceived. And one core question and goal was to integrate and celebrate art of indigenous artists and their ongoing presence in these lands and more broadly across the continent. And one essential aspect of that integration was through consultation with Native advisors. And obviously this project is just a breathtaking example, the way that Painted enacted that methodology so beautifully in bringing that chorus of voices to bear on this space and this exhibition in a beautifully fluid way. And I think that leaving room and time for that fluidity and that relationship building and conversation and sharing in the exhibition planning process, really leaning into the journey of it, not just the product, or maybe not even really the product, more about the experience itself, has been one of my big takeaways for what feels like a good way forward in that effort to bring these stories together. And I also just wanted to agree with Jamie about how important it is to bring contemporary art in dialogue with historical art. And I think I've seen some reticence on the part of a lot of quote-unquote American art collections to do that. They want to stick to some kind of chronological script, some kind of hermetic purity around style or form. But when we think of the grand scale of time, this is all everything, everywhere, all at once, and we can really spend time thinking cyclically and in a more fluid way than this like linear progress-driven narrative. So I found integrating, like so many of these amazing projects before us, contemporary art in with historical to speak back in many ways, to be one of the more powerful aspects of that work. And I think we can continue to improve consultation structures, compensation, and those kinds of approaches better and better over time. And I could talk more about that, but I'm going to stop there.
So I'm in a fairly unique position at the Denver Art Museum, which is the only encyclopedic museum in the entire world that has a department dedicated to Western American art. That department, so as I like to say, we tell the story of American art from a Western perspective. Now that department is only 20 years old. In contrast, our department and collections of indigenous arts of North America is nearing its 100th year anniversary in 2025. So I, as a settler scholar, have the great benefit and opportunity of working in a global institution with colleagues, John Lukovic and Dakota Haska, whom I'm sure many of you know, who along with their predecessors and their many communities, have done so much of the hard work to tell the history of indigenous North America at the Denver Art Museum. And when you visit the Denver Art Museum, it is a high-rise structure, and you'll notice that every floor is dedicated to a permanent collection. We do not integrate our collections. We do, however, borrow strategically from each other in a very collegial fashion. So when you come to the Denver Art Museum and you visit the Western American art permanent galleries, you will see that there are moments. Note also that our collection spans 200 years, which in the history of what we now call the American West is a teeny, teeny, tiny little drop in the depth of the history of the peoples and of arts production in that region. So we recognize our limitations, and what we're able to do is borrow strategically and point to the other collections at the museum, the Indigenous Arts Collection, the Latin American collection, the Ancient American collections, for example, and really point to them as the places to go to learn more about this deeper history, while within the Western art galleries, very carefully integrating specific materials from those collections to help our visitors understand that the history that is on display in the paintings on our floor really spans this much time, and there's a much deeper, richer history there to be explored and understood if you really want to understand the history of this country and of the American West. And like we've heard from my colleagues here on stage, we have community members with whom we consult. We have an Indigenous Advisory Council, and it really is my responsibility, as a settler scholar, to acknowledge that expertise and to ask for help, to be accountable to those communities. A few examples of that it include me going to our council meetings every quarter and telling them what I'm up to and bringing to them questions or issues that might arise out of the artworks on display on the 7th floor. But when we do temporary exhibitions and when we do new interpretation for the permanent gallery, we hire Indigenous readers to review our text. And we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about what we do not know and what we need to learn, and also where those boundaries are in terms of what we can and can't know. So those are just some examples of how we work in collaboration with our colleagues at the Denver Art Museum.
So at the Cal Sharp Historic Site, we're the home and studios of VI Cal's Joseph Henry Sharp, and with the opening of the Lunder Research Center, almost 2 years ago, our focus really shifted to a larger story on the Taos Society of Artists, but the early artists of Taos, but that's entirely leveraged on the Indigenous and Hispano community largely in Taos. So our focus can't be anything but that. So in the last, half dozen years, I would say more than half of our exhibitions and programs have been either focused on the Indigenous and Hispano communities and or co-curated by Indigenous and Hispano communities, because that is our story. And our entire focus has shifted from the preservation of a beautiful historic site to telling the story of a very complex history that is very nuanced. And we've only scratched the surface in talking all day. There's so much more to do, and that's what's exciting. And I just have to congratulate Colby College Museum of Art, the Lunder Foundation, the curatorial team, designers, and everyone that put their time and energy and heart into this, because this is groundbreaking. This is what museums need to be doing. And this is moving the discourse forward. And that's exciting. And we're doing it in Maine. Okay? Like, how cool is that? And I can say that because I'm a New Englander. My family goes way back in Connecticut and Maine, so it's okay. I understand all you have to deal with. It's all right. So yeah, there's no way. I think our challenge in the museum world is, how do you hang these paintings in a gallery and not bring in the Native voice? You cannot. And you need to identify who the models are, and you need to tell their stories. And that's really become the focus of the Lunder Research Center, is to be that conduit of archives, knowledge, and Taos Pueblo voices, bringing those voices to the forefront so that we as museum curators have access to that material, and there's no excuse to hang those paintings and not have the stories behind them, not have the stories of the relationships of the artists and the models, and why that was impactful, and what was the context of the period, and how did these paintings move the discourse forward 100 years ago? Because they did. In almost a similar way we are today. And that's really important. So that's a lot of the work that we do. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about all of this, and especially being on this panel with you all. I'm very honored. I think I have a very different perspective. So I come from a family of artists, and in my family, people made money by selling their works. In Diné or Navajo language, we don't actually have a word for art. And so kind of just growing up and seeing that specifically women in my family produce works to make money was a really interesting perspective. And then I found my way at RISD. I'm the first person to work full-time with our Native American art collection. So we've been accepting gifts since 1900 and then started acquiring in 1944. So it's really interesting to hear everyone else's perspectives. And the first curatorial project I worked on at the RISD Museum was called Being and Believing in the Natural World, Perspectives from Ancient Mediterranean, Asia, and Indigenous North America. So that show actually put Native art in conversation with ancient art and Asian art. And you might be wondering, well, how did that happen? And it's because of a curatorial team of about 11. All of those departments had curators of color. So me and my colleagues, Dr. Chong and Dr. Borromeo, just grew really close and thought about these works of art not from an ethnographic lens, right? So it's not like, oh, this is native, this is Asian, and this is ancient. The show actually combined all of the works, seeing them as storytelling, seeing them through the lenses of materiality. And so I didn't, I wasn't trained, I don't have an art history degree, and seeing things in maybe a really critical and boxed in lens. And I am fortunate enough to work at RISD, where we've known for being a little bit more experimental. So things that, Western art historians might cringe at, I was like, let's do it. And so, that's kind of the work that we're doing at RISD. And it's also great to bring our Native students along into that process. So some of my student workers for that show wrote labels for the works, especially if they were from that home community, because I see myself more as a facilitator of knowledge than an authoritarian of knowledge, and reading the past RISD curatorial files is cringy, seeing how people really thought they were authoritarians on things they had they didn't even know what they didn't know. So as a facilitator, what I really like to do is get folks in from the communities for our historic works, and the pieces that we have in the collection are, again, most of the time, and not all the time, but the historic pieces were tourism items. So folks were making those to make money and to survive. So I like to think about that also in labels as what does it mean for someone's, as we've all been talking about today, spirit and relationality to the work to go out into the world and to find its way to Providence, Rhode Island, because it's a way of survivance. And then bringing in our contemporary artists is really exciting, because they're allowed to tell their own stories. But to get back to the root of the question, I think Native art can be in conversation with many different categories of art, and I often question why we have to be in this categorization when Native culture in general doesn't even have a word for art. So thinking about things in an interdisciplinary lens, and also thinking about the women, for me specifically, who have always been making curatorial choices, they just weren't called curatorial choices. So thinking about the way my grandma has all of our family photos on the wall, it's a curatorial project. But I don't know how Western art historians would feel about me saying that, but that's how I feel.
Okay. So the next question we have for you all is about obstacles. It's worth 500 points. What obstacles in your work of putting Euro-American and Native American art together? What are the barriers to elaborating on these histories, and what are the opportunities?
Picking up off of Sháńdíín's comment about within many communities not having a word for art. When I teach with my students, one of the things that I try and convey to them is that art as a Western concept is very limiting and limited in comparison to the way we talk about things within our Indigenous communities and the way that Indigenous communities throughout the globe talk about the things that are made that are, yes, aesthetically beautiful, but they're also, things that are used to carry knowledge, that are embedded with stories, that connect us to place and to people and our relations. And so thinking about how we can kind of take that understanding and definition and actually apply that to things that had previously just been thought of as art objects that were made by Western makers, can actually be an opportunity to kind of expand and have a really kind of generous interpretation of the things that we're placing in conversation in galleries. And so, that becomes an opportunity. I think the danger there and, why it's so important to kind of ground that complexity and nuance is, there's always a danger of flattening the experience of Indigenous communities. There are over 570 federally recognized nations that have, a government-to-government relationship with the United States. And so demonstrating that diversity in gallery settings, but also here, when we speak publicly that, I'm an Osage person, but I don't speak on behalf of my community. I speak for myself, and certainly not for all Native or Indigenous peoples either. That, that flattening becomes, I think, one of the biggest traps that faces us in our work.
It's also just time.
Yeah, time and money.
Working with community, as you all know and have been doing, takes a lot of time and needs to be financially supported.
It needs to be funded.
So I have found that one needs to have the support of an institution to build in the requisite timelines in exhibition and project development to really attend to the amount of listening that needs to be done to do this work respectfully. And I do feel that if we take an overview of the field of curating, it's no longer enough to be an expert. You must have expertise, but now more than ever, you must listen. Spend a lot of time listening, and it's time. That can be a real obstacle when it comes to convincing your institution why. But hopefully that's just part of the work that we continue doing. And I do like to think of our permanent galleries, for example, as iterative. These are living spaces where the voices will change, the perspectives will change over time, not on a set schedule necessarily, but always, if we can. That's the ideal. So we don't think of these exhibits as static, we think of them as living.
Building on that, time and money is huge because this has to be done thoughtfully, sensitive, with real relationships. That's the important part. And just thinking about obstacles, like one of our challenges now, getting back to education, right? We talked about how do you understand the work, how do you bring value to that work and its education. And we're now in a time, in a place where, our information is reduced to very small bits. And we talk about the myth of the vanishing race. Well, I would argue that the Pueblo people in American consciousness are a vanished race. Most people don't know who the Pueblo people are. They don't know the connection to ancestral Puebloan. And, most of our American history is 19th century. It doesn't go back to what was happening before that and how complex and rich these cultures were. So our greatest obstacle, I think, is education, is getting our American educational system up to speed where we understand this complex history. Like I often joke, our ulterior motive is to use American art history to rewrite American history. Because art is a great way to reach people and have these conversations, right? And we talk about museums being safe places to have difficult conversations. Well, our own history is a very difficult conversation. But artists can help break that down. And they can do it through humor and sci-fi and all these clever ways that engage people. And so that's an obstacle, but really it's a fun challenge for us.
I guess I would just add in interpretation is something that I find challenging. So I have an exhibition up at the RISD Museum now called Diné Textiles Nijunigo Haradite, which is about recontextualizing our Diné textiles as garments. So I had a lot of fun seeing all of the textiles in the exhibition. And it recently opened in September. It'll be up until the next September. And at first, I was the one giving all of the tours because it's my baby. This is like such a special project for me because I come from a family of Diné weavers. And then I realized that's a crazy idea to give every single tour. There's just not enough time. So then I was like sharing with our docents about how I would like the works to be interpreted. And I think just letting your project out in the world and admitting that like, I can't be there for every walkthrough and hoping that audiences spend time and listen and kind of see the vision is challenging because we've also all been at a museum where this is your 12th gallery and you can't read every single label and you're tired and you just want to look at the pieces. So I definitely think that the pieces speak for themselves because it's a combination of historic and contemporary weavings. So I do think that the pieces can speak on their own. But for certain audiences who really don't know Diné history, I hope that they understand the specificities of why those works are so important. So like even hearing today from the Pueblo artist talking about Pueblo revolt, I was thinking like in my own work and with my editor at RISD, I was writing about the Navajo Long Walk and our forced imprisonment at Cueldet or Bosque Redondo, and how I just kind of like briefly wrote about it. And the feedback was, you really need to get into this, because even though that's something that I'm very aware of, the general Providence, Rhode Island community is not. And it's a balance between keeping people's interests in a 100-word label and also having them really take seriously, like, art is a reflection of our history, and that's why you see such a dramatic shift in Diné weavings, is because people had such a shift in their lives and their livelihoods. And I just hope that our audiences kind of understand and can grasp what a life-altering and traumatic event that was for folks. And so there's like videos in this space, and there's poetry. So all of these things I kind of hope can be interpreted. And then to kind of also solve that issue, I'm working with like our media team to do like a tour that is like recorded so folks at home can watch and also Diné folks can watch. And kind of what Jamie was saying about nuances, like something that I'm interested in talking about with other curators as well is like for some of the textiles, there's the Spider Woman cross. And some Diné people, you know, have very different interpretations. Some people think about it as our 4 sacred mountains. Some people think about it as 4 directions. But making sure our audiences know that different weavers have different interpretations. There's over 400,000 Diné people, and so it's a myth for me to say that one design has one specific meaning, but I think that's what audiences want because it's more digestible. Yeah. And so being able to communicate nuances through label text is difficult. So that's why I love being the one to be there and give the tour. But I am only one woman, so it just doesn't happen.
I think both of you bring up a really good point, and the interpretation aspect of things, but then also the education and I forget now where I was going. But anyways, when I moved to Minnesota, one of the things that I noticed walking through the galleries at MIA is one of our docents was walking through and talking about Pueblo pottery. I just happened to be walking through the gallery at that time, and they said the Pueblo people used to live in New Mexico at this point. And I'm like, because I'm here in Minnesota now? Is this the one Pueblo person moved to Minnesota? So I think that's making people aware and understanding those narratives that, and educating people that don't necessarily know those stories, especially bringing a Pueblo story to Maine or a Pueblo story to Minnesota, that the population in those communities isn't going to know what you're talking about a lot of the times. And understanding, that's where I was going back to. Like Virgil, I think Virgil said this earlier, is that people ask him, oh, what part of Mexico are you from? People don't really necessarily know that New Mexico is still a thing. And New Mexico is no longer a territory, it's an actual state. It's one of the 50 states in the US. And I think that's one of the hardest things to kind of convey to people, is that trying to explain, since all the Pueblo communities have like Spanish names, we're called Pueblos for one thing. And I think that's the hardest thing to make people understand, is that there's a diverse cultures between each of the Pueblos. There's a diverse culture between all the different communities within New Mexico, especially along the Rio Grande. There's old Spanish settlements, there's Pueblo villages, and there's an intermingling of all these different communities, and every community is diverse. Every community is completely different. So interpreting that in museums, I think that is one of the biggest challenges. And I guess that leads into this next question of what narratives are missing in Western art, and how do you present those narratives in Western art and museum practice?
So many narratives
Yeah.
are missing. And it
Pick
is
one.
not just the over 500 Native nations, it's also people from the continent of Asia, people from Central America. I mean, there are so many narratives that are often missing in collections of American art, I would argue, and that is ongoing work. And to your question, I don't know the solution, but I do think that in the case of the Denver Art Museum, thinking of our spaces as iterative and always more inclusive, it helps us not let perfect get in the way of good. Like, do the best work you can and always be striving for better.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say there's so many opportunities in museums and art museums in particular to use the artwork to debunk myth and tell more narratives. I mean, there's no end to the material. And, you know, there's so many perspectives. So I think the responsibility is ours to use those as teaching moments and educational opportunities that, I mean, especially large museums with large collections. I mean, there's no end to being able to pull those paintings out, and especially talking about the West and, you know, manifest destiny and westward expansion. I mean, there's so much material to pull from. I think that's our responsibility, is to use those teaching moments, use the collections that 50 years ago were perpetuating a shared narrative, and now we're saying, yeah, that's not exactly the shared narrative. So, I mean, that's it. What's exciting is this is a moment in history where we're having these conversations. You know, being at the American Alliance of Museum Conference in Denver last year, that was the entire conversation. I mean, the entire museum world is talking about, how do we tell a better story? How do we bring these voices that have been marginalized into the fore? So, you know, it's not like it's just happening in pockets. And I understand Brian's frustration. We have a very long way to go in the museum world, but the conversations are happening, and this is a great example that we're all in Maine talking about it.
I think it's not just about kind of what stories haven't been told, but what parts of kind of the, you know, predominant story haven't been told. So, you know, how deeply entangled art has always been in, you know, U.S. federal policy. And, you know, I think I hear lots of people now say, oh, art's gotten so political. And it's like, art has always been really political. And like, you know, like if you know, Bierstadt's first, you know, trip out west was funded by the U.S. Department of War. You know, so many early, you know, of those landscape painters and photographers were, you know, being paid by the U.S. government to take images to bring back to the East to show, you know, and to help kind of craft this narrative of manifest destiny. And so, you know, we have to kind of tell the complete story of that. And, you know, I always ask my students, like, one of the most interesting questions you can ask in any museum is like, where's the money coming from? You know, it's like, you know, even today, but also back then, reading the credit lines on things, or, you know, kind of digging into the history of, you know, who's paying for this and to what end. Because, you know, arts funding has always been very kind of tangled in these political projects in interesting ways. And so telling those stories as well. But I also think kind of not losing sight when Sháńdíín was talking about Bosque Redondo and, you know, women creating work and the shift in, you know, what those practices looked like. That, like, in those moments of limitation, there were women creating incredible works of beauty and still passing down these traditions. And so, you know, kind of focusing on not necessarily the violence and trauma of these moments, kind of recognizing those and reckoning with that history, but, you know, amplifying the incredible capacity and brilliance of the people who, in those spaces of limitation, were creating the great works of beauty they were able to appreciate in these institutions today.
Well, I think, is it about time for, do we have time for a couple questions, do you think, Sierra? Is that good? Okay. Does anybody have any questions for our wonderful panelists?
I do. Hi, my name is Sebastian. I'm from Canada, Cree. I have a question for the Indigenous people on the panel. I mean, we were a trading community back in the day before settlers came. We shared what we would maybe call art now, where we would share knowledge and trade and do different things. You would know where somebody was from based on beadwork, based on their hair and how they would set themselves up. Do you think at some point now we're at a time basically where we're bringing that back, but through art in a more contemporary sense, in a place that's called an institution? This is my question. Does that make sense? Or?
Well, I think we're at a critical point where a lot of artists and a lot of people are kind of going down the trail of discovering their identities and rediscovering identity and rediscovering what it is to be Indigenous. I think the hard part about American history is that it has homogenized us as a people throughout the country. We can say we're Indian, people are going to think that we all look the same, or they're going to have a specific idea of who we're supposed to look like. And I think that's the hard part about it, but I think we're at the point where it is very important, and I think it's almost trauma-based too. So I think it's a lot of people navigating the trauma, the historical trauma that our people have been going through, have experienced, but it's also reconnecting with those identities. I'm not sure if I'm conveying that right, but I think there's a lot of artists that are recognizing where they're from and remembering where they're from, and that goes back to the spirit and it being embedded within our DNA. We create what our spirit is telling us to create, and the land that wherever we're at is going to tell us how to create the work that we're doing, or even tell the stories that we're telling. I don't necessarily wake up and think, oh, I'm going to write this today. When I'm sitting there writing labels, I really just sit down and write whenever it comes out. I'm not really conscious about what I'm writing or doing anything as far as labels or anything like that in a museum curatorial practice. It just comes out and I'm able to kind of convey it. Then I clean it up afterwards so it doesn't look all weird. But I think we're in a place where a lot of our people are really rediscovering their identity, and I think it's making us stronger as Native people across the country. And I think recognizing things like recognizing that there was a forced assimilation throughout America, and that our people were placed in these blood quantum degrees, and that was a part of the forced assimilation as well, to separate our people and to kind of remove that identity from our peoples. So it's really important to keep in mind that there are a lot of people that don't necessarily know where they come from, and they want to explore that. And I think there's so many that can open up so many doors. So I'm not going to go too far down that. But other thing is, I think we're at a critical point right now where museums and other institutions are listening. Mm-hmm. They are listening, and I think that a lot of the movement I've seen has been happening during probably the past 3 or 4 years, where museums are really willing to listen, some of them, but at the same time, I think we're at a critical point for people to just rediscover identity, reinterpret their identity too.
Yeah, I love the point that you brought up about kind of foregrounding the knowledge that international trade preceded the arrival of Europeans. I think that gets lost. And so, our Indigenous peoples were always incorporating materials that were traded with other communities into their artistic practices. That just really kind of ramped up when settlers arrived and those, trade networks that became global then. But I think you're also speaking to, or what I hear you saying is, you're kind of referencing the idea that so many people, I think, artists try and meet expectations of what the market wants, right? And oftentimes people do that because they have a need to feed their families. And, so, there's the role that those outside expectations have in kind of shaping what work can look like. But I see a lot of strength in artists, and I think what artists are recognizing now, and why there's this kind of return to, and some communities never lost it, certainly like within Pueblo pottery tradition, like going back to that specificity of designs and patterns and practices that came, from within the specific context of your community. There's something universal about that specificity because it's so deeply personal that I think artists and audiences are able to have more meaningful conversations at an interpersonal level when there's that kind of focus on the local and the specific kind of traditions from within one's own community.
I think I would just add, like, I'm really interested in looking at museums as like a place for celebration. And like when I was younger, my grandma would like make me the like cutest little Navajo velveteen outfits. And I was like, I don't really want to wear this. Like I want to wear Justice or overalls or like Gap. And I went to the Heard Museum on a field trip. I was like maybe in the 3rd grade and saw these beautiful like Navajo velveteen dresses in the cases. And like my mind was like, wow, like I wanted to go home and put mine on too. And I think that like seeing and especially thinking about like the next generation, having these Native artists who are making really cool works and it's a point of celebration. And I think I can also say that from a position where I like didn't face as much cultural oppression as like my grandma who was in boarding school or my mom who was growing up in like the 70s. So, I kind of try to be and keep my perspective from that of like being a humble person, but trying to see also like the next generations of Native people and who I hope never have to experience that type of cultural shame that I'm an other or like I need to hide this, which I think is really cool to see institutions as a place where we can celebrate who we are and have these reverse experiences that our grandparents did of being, ashamed of who they are. And then also seeing that I'm really interested in fashion and jewelry and how we use that as cultural markers. So like today I'm wearing like, these were all gifts, but like Sedna seal earrings and a seal cuff. And like, so my people never had seal skins, we're desert dwellers, but thinking about how like back then, you would get gifts and gift giving is a huge aspect of our culture and in fashion. And how like even on the body you can curate a story to be told if people and like I love asking other Native ladies like what earrings are you wearing, who made your earrings, and so that's kind of like the work that I'm interested in is like seeing museums as a place to like uplift who we are as people, and that doesn't always have to be super traditional. And I think it's great to remind audiences and even Native people ourselves that we're always adapting and changing, and it's okay not to be super traditional. And that's how our people have survived, by like adapting and using new materials.